Can I request all of you to switch off the video?
Me too.
A very good evening, everyone. On behalf of Sahapedia, Padmapriya here, welcoming you to Sahapedia's Week 2 of the Culture for All Digital Festival 2021. We started this festival in January 2021, and after almost a year-long celebration, we are concluding it this November. Supported by Tata Technologies, we have curated this festival with diversity and inclusion in mind, have performances, talks, workshops, trails, contests, and much more to keep you all engaged. The festival is also a celebration for us at Sahapedia, as we're releasing the first of its kind interactive, multilingual, open access digital cultural map called map.sahapedia.org. We'll now have a quick look at the website. You can learn and share and make your own trails and do loads more on this platform. So do check it out and browse when you have the time. Coming back to today's evening's program, it's going to be a conversation titled Sister Love, Notes Towards Building an Indian Feminist Archive. We will engage in a discussion on the visibility or the invisibility of women's accomplishments in historical and contemporary contexts in India. Through their work and experiences, our speakers for today evening, Anna M. Vetticad, Urvashi Butalia, and Sneha Gole will unpack how gender and gender-related mechanisms can be unraveled and represented. They'll explore what archiving means to them, the importance of archives for gender movements, and the ways in which we can capture her narratives, her stories, and her outcomes in the Indian context. A quick introduction to all our speakers today. Urvashi Butalia, we all know her as an Indian feminist, writer, and activist. She's the director of Zubaan, a leading independent publishing house, and the co-founder of Kali for Women, India's first feminist publisher. She has several works to her credit, including The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India, and Speaking Peace, Women's Voices from Kashmir. Dr. Sneha Gole, our second speaker, is an assistant professor at the Krantijyoti Savitribai Phule Women's Studies Center, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Her research areas are social movements in contemporary India with special focus on women's movements, gender, and culture. Anna Vetticad is a feminist, award-winning journalist, and the author of the critically acclaimed bestseller, The Adventures of an Intrepid Film Critic. She's currently an independent journalist who writes for various national and international publications. Her area of specialization is the intersection of cinema with feminist and other socio-political concerns. So I'm going to pass the mantle to Anna. Request you to start this exciting conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Padma Priya, for having me over here. And I have to say it's a pleasure for me to speak to be moderating a discussion with people who I respect so much. And I'm sure Sneha will not mind me saying that Urvashi is obviously an icon of the Indian feminist movement. And so for both of us to be on this panel is an honor. I was just wondering if both of you, we could start off by, if both of you would make introductory remarks on your interpretation of the theme, which Padma Priya had read out. But before you do that, I thought I would introduce, I would introduce the audience to my interpretation of the theme through my favorite medium of communication, which is cinema. Now, there is a film called Richter Scale 7.6. That was a Malayalam film that was released earlier this year on a streaming platform. It is about the displacement of marginalized communities in the name of development. It is made by a woman, director, Jiva KJ, who was in fact who has told the media that the stories she was telling are based on the experiences of her own husband and her husband's community. And it starts out with a song, the lyrics of which I think basically explain everything that this theme means to me. I'm going to read part of it in Malayalam, and then I'm going to give a translation. It goes, "Iniyulla kalam nammal padandirunnal, naadinte nattal potti nammal chagum. Chavandirikkanengilum paadadi theyye, paadittu chavanengilum paadadi theyye." And just roughly speaking, the translation is that if in coming times we do not sing, then the backbone of our homeland will be broken and we will die. If for no other reason than to ward off death, you must sing. If for no other reason than to die singing, you must sing. And to me, this song was about because as all colonizers and all dominant communities tend to do when they record histories, they tend to record histories from their points of view. They tend to tell their stories, the stories of their achievements, and the interpretations of all battles from their point of view. And here we have a folk singer singing about the need for us. Now, the us in his case is very different from the us that the three of us represent in our personal lives, but we are speaking here about women in general and the archiving of women's histories. So Urvashi and Sneha, I'm going to give the mic to you. If you could please give us your introductory remarks on the theme. Sneha, would you like to start first?
All right. So good evening, and thanks to Sahopedia and Padmapriya for having me on this panel. I mean, as Anna rightly said, Urvashi is an icon, and in many ways, somebody who has been so deeply involved with the question of feminist archiving in India that it is a little intimidating to be speaking in the same panel as her. But what I will try and do, though I'm here individually. I don't speak individually. I'm going to try and reflect on the experiences of the collective that I am a part of, the Women's Studies Center, which takes the name of Krantijyoti Savitribai Phule. In fact, it was when it started more than 25 years ago, it started with that name. The university where we are located has only subsequently followed suit many years later. So I'm going to try and reflect actually on some of the learnings, collective learnings that we have had at the center, because we've been involved in some sort of work on thinking about the archive, rethinking histories, her stories, and also rethinking the idea of her story through a variety of interventions. And I'll try and just put forth three or four major sort of reflections on the basis of that. So the first thing actually I want to say is that when I was thinking about the topic, one of the things that, and I think this also reflects back from what our students who have been involved subsequently in these sort of little archiving projects that we have done have also said, that for me personally, also as an individual who came to the women's movement in a particular point in history, where much of, in a sense, the heydays, so to say, of the movement seem to have already bypassed us, and we, sort of became political, started seeing ourselves as feminists when people were already saying, oh, there was once a movement. And therefore, for me, I think personally, what has been extremely enriching, and I'm therefore indebted to those like Urvashi who not only lived that history, but also tried to create a record of that history for people who came after them. So when I think of myself as a feminist person and as someone who's located within gender studies, a large sense of that comes from actually the feminist archiving work, some of it available as printed books like the history of doing, but much of it also available in these posters stored in drawers of these documentation centers that one went to as a master's or a bachelor student, or these booklets of songs, and many times. And I think that has been for me also individually very important. Memories that one heard older feminists very generously share and recount, and therefore creating in that sense this archive, because I started work with a feminist organization in Gujarat as a young 21-year-old, and I would hear this founder always tell me these remarkable stories of how the organization came about, and I would tell her, but how is somebody who doesn't talk to you directly going to know about it? And for me, therefore, the sense of, and therefore subsequently some of the work that I individually and collectively have been a part of comes from that, because I feel that feminist archiving is extremely important to give us a sense of where we come from, and also therefore the kinds of futures that we can imagine for generations of young people who want to see themselves as feminists. That's one. Secondly, I think, and also reflecting therefore on the title, and whereas I think Sister Love is a very inspiring and catchy title, I think it has it's a double-edged thing, because while it indexes towards a certain idea of solidarity, towards a certain idea of collectivity, the sisters can also be very sometimes knowingly, a lot of times unknowingly, also then become some sort of core within the margins. And for instance, I mean, like, and I've always find that story very useful to think about what we mean by that. When I think about, in that sense, the contrasting sort of trajectories that someone like Anandibai Joshi and Rakhmabai have had. And now, of course, in the last few years, thanks to the Google Doodle, etc., everybody suddenly seems to know Rakhmabai. But for a very long time, in a context like Maharashtra, where Anandibai Joshi was celebrated, and that's not to take away from her struggles at all, as the first doctor, we never knew Rakhmabai. And I think that has to do both with, in some ways, the social locations of these women, but also in some ways to their relationship with patriarchy. So, I mean, and Anandibai Joshi is remembered, therefore, as someone who stuck to, the Hindu-ness of herself and a married Hindu woman, as against Rakhmabai, who challenges this idea of, whether her, she doesn't want to be in the marriage that has been contracted for her. And I think that those stories tell us something about also this process of constructing the archive. The feminist archive also has to be very, very conscious to these multiple marginalities within. So yes, women are a margin, but not all women are margins, in the same ways. So for instance, in a city like Pune, Savitribai is still remembered, but Fatima Sheikh and Mukta Sare are not. So, and I think that therefore this sister and the sisterhood that it wants to imagine can be a slightly double-edged sort of sword. And that's something that we've also learned. So that's something that I wanted to flag off. And I'll just flag off a third point, and I'll stop, which is also this notion, and therefore for us, what has been a major learning experience is that the archive, as it has come to us through history, whatever, and feminists have, of course, really challenged that idea of the dead archive that sits there. And as Anna, you were saying, it obviously, the archive is so moored in an hierarchy of power, and feminists have really tried to challenge that. But the other thing, therefore, that we feel is very important is to rethink the idea of selection, contributors, and that's again been something that we've been trying to do at the center, where we often say, oh, students don't go to the archive, or we say, oh, the younger generation doesn't go to the archive, they're not interested in the archive. But can we then reverse the process of saying the building of the archive, and therefore the student not just as a consumer of the archive, but as someone with whom you actively co-produce the archive. So for me, those are some of the, I think, and the fourth and the last thing that I want to just index is also therefore what the archive means. And for us at the center, one of the major learnings of what an archive can do, just this idea of documenting and collecting, really came from looking at Dr. Chandra Rege's work, where she began actually her work through a process of trying to document the Ambedkarite, congregations at the, at Chaitya Bhumi, at Diksha Bhumi, at Bhima Korega. And it is actually through that documentation and through that archive that she theorized a completely different way of understanding these, which were often dismissed as, whatever, consumerist, which were dismissed as these kinds of mindless following, to actually theorize her, her understanding of these as Dalit counterpublic. So, I mean, therefore we see also the archive theory and knowledge making in this sort of a process. So I think those are some of the 3 or 4 directions that I see as important in terms of today's topic and today's sort of discussion.
Okay, thanks so much, Sneha. Urvashi?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Sahapidia and Padampriya. And Sneha has actually made my task a lot easier because she said many of the things I would have also said. Just to quickly reiterate that with the awareness, I mean, there are a lot of women's organizations in India at this time who are working on creating feminist archives. And a couple of years ago, several of them, about 25 of them, came together in Delhi to have a meeting to discuss exactly the kinds of issues that Sneha is pointing to. What is the archive? Is it a living thing? Is it a dead thing? What are the sort of things we collect? How do we select them? What is access all about? And how do we make things available? And how are we simultaneously countering the absences of history, the absences of women and other marginalized communities in history? And yet at the same time being self-aware of not repeating those patterns ourselves in our practices. So all of those things, I think, are very live at the moment. So what does sister love, the title of this thing, mean? To me, this is what it means. The awareness among women from different communities, they could be academics, they could be scholars, they could be libraries, they could be archivists, they could be queer groups, they could be workers groups, laborers groups, and so on. The awareness that nobody's documenting our histories. And if we have to do it, we have to do it ourselves. And how do we do it ourselves? And how do we share with each other so that we don't repeat what the other person is doing and we learn from each other's experiences? I think in some senses, that's what it means. And I want to just come at this with a few stories that might help to illustrate things. When I say nobody's telling our histories, till the mid-70s, till women became a legitimate subject of inquiry and research with the arrival or with the thinking around a discipline called women's studies. And for all the things that it has, all the complications that it has, which I shan't go into just now, we didn't even know how to begin studying the histories of women. Now we have some of those tools, not all of them. And that has enabled this locating of these histories, which is why, for example, Google would even have information about Rahmabai to be able to create a doodle on her, or what she means in the history of the feminist movement and so on. So I think that is one thing that has begun to happen. And this awareness that as feminism and as women's movements grow in India, which they indeed are, the newer generations also need that history as much as we did when we were growing up, of our mothers and people like that. So the newer generations also need that history, and they also need to be able to question that history. And how much of a need there is, okay. So, I, like Sneha is a full-time teacher. I teach every now and again, and I teach a course in feminism at 2 or 3 universities. When I first started teaching this course about 6 years ago, there was at the university where I taught it a very, very popular course on Indian history and on the people, told through the lives of people. But that meant told through the lives of men. There was not one woman in it. And when I heard this, I was infuriated. And then I did a session in my course, which has got only women in the making of modern India. And it was not difficult to find them. It was called Makers of Modern India too. It was only women, but it was also amazing to see how little people knew about them and how that little bit of information about these 20 or so women is only the tip of the iceberg, telling us how much more there must have been and how much more is lost to history. So I think it's very important to do that. And the other thing is that for us in Zubaan and previously in Kali, when we set up Kali, the idea was really what Sneha talked about, to create a different kind of knowledge, to counter the knowledge that existed. And to say, here we are, you can't do a book of sociology, go to a village, interview the men and think you're doing something that is complete. No. But the process of learning how to do that was also a process that taught us that, the first step to counter an absence is to populate that space with numbers. But then the next step is to ask who those numbers comprise and who they leave out. So then you look at all the layered marginalities that lie under the category woman. So urban English-speaking women, we began with them. But now for us, the margins are the center. And that's when we realized the importance of this process. And then when we did this project, we did a project early on to collect a visual history, or map a visual history of the women's movement through its posters. And we decided to see if there was a collective way in which we could do it. We did it with lots of women's groups, 161 women's groups working together across India in a transparent and collective manner. And this archive now exists as a free access archive. And it is used a lot by all sorts of people who can use it for educational purposes, for media purposes, so on and so forth. But it's that exercise that actually taught us what the nuts and bolts of archiving mean, as opposed to the idea that we carried in our head. So it's also a constant learning process. So I'll stop there and see what further questions you might have.
Okay. Sneha, I was wondering if I could come to you and ask you if you could explain in detail the Blue Plaque project that Padma Priya had mentioned, the background to it, and where it stands at now.
Okay, so the Blue Plaque actually, I mean, as you know, in London, there are these blue plaques that mark, the places of historic importance, and people who lived, like, marks the places where people, historical figures were born or lived or worked or whatever. And this was actually taken up by this trust in Pune called the Tilak Trust. I mean,
The Tilak Trust.
The Tilak Trust. They were the ones who actually sort of put it up. They put up the initial list, but it was also sort of, whatever, authorized by the PMC, so to say. So there was like an official, blue plaque, this thing. And if you go around in the city of Pune, you will see these physical blue plaques on, on buildings where historical figures had either lived. It was either their workplaces or places of birth, depending on what they could map. But the interesting thing about this list is, I mean, just like Urvashi is saying about the bakers of modern India, if you look at this list, it has some 160 or so odd this thing, and there are like 2 or 3 women in that. Right. I mean, the official list has, and then I think subsequently after it got expanded, it still had some 8 or 10 women, not more than that. And like I pointed out, most of these were, so yes, of course, I mean, in a city like Pune, you cannot not have a plaque for Savitribai. But, on the same plaque in that same Bhidewada where she taught, Fatima Sheikh, for instance, was not mentioned. It had one dismal number of women, and 2 that, it had this sort of all of these hierarchies of which women featured in it. So actually, when Sahapedia started this culture mapping project, and we started talking with them at the center, one of the ideas, therefore, was, that we map this gender history of Pune and what are the different ways in which we can do that. And one of the first projects, therefore, that we took up with them was to create these. So these are digital blue plaques now, where we try and, so again, I mean, there were 2 kinds of major exclusions, right? One was, of course, that they were mostly men. 2, that, all history of Pune seemed to stop at like 1950, as if there had been nothing of note or nobody of note that happened after that. So largely, much older men were a mainstay of that list. And of course, there was a lot of, emphasis on the reformist, nationalist sort of, framework. So even the men who featured in the list largely came from the social reform sort of trajectory, or, they came from the mainstream nationalist trajectory. In many ways, marginalizing also the very rich anti-caste legacies that have been a part of the history of Pune. And this became extremely important, especially also because if today you think about Pune and the way in which, different players in the field, so to say, are imagining and wanting to establish the idea of the heritage of Pune. There is a way in which a certain brand, so Pune as the land of Peshwas, the Puneri Pagdi, which are all symbols of a certain kind of hegemonic order, are also becoming re-inscribed in that sense more strongly as the heritage of the city. And therefore, for us, when we started thinking about the digital blue plaques, the idea was not only, therefore, to get women to be in it, but also, therefore, rethink the idea of what really is the history of Pune, what really is the heritage of Pune, and who do we want to sort of read back into that history. Where, though, I mean, the majority of the plaques that we did were women, we were not, we also did men. We also looked at men who had contributed in that sense to the question of gender history, and that meant a rethinking of what is this idea of women's history, right? So you're not just therefore looking at women, you're looking at the question of gender relations, and you're saying anyone who contributed in making for a more just society. So for instance, someone like Satyaranjan Sathe, we did have whatever on him, because he's been a part of of founding, for instance, one of the first autonomous what came to be then an autonomous women's group in Pune, though he was a man, and also looked at these histories. So women like Fatima Sheikh, or women like Mukta Sarve, or many other Satyashodhak Ambedkarite women who had been a part of these anti-caste legacies might not actually therefore have been, or something like the Pune Pact. That the Pune Pact, which is remembered in nationalist historiography as actually, a sort of, there's a question mark about it. And in fact, Sharmila's work looks at how Ambedkarite anti-caste publics remember Pune Pact very differently. So inscribing some of these stories back into, the way the city, the urban space is imagined was what we were trying to do. And so we made a list, and actually the making of the list, who are the people who should be on the list, was also a collaborative exercise, of getting students, because there's also students who are doing gender studies. What do they see as gender history? Who do they think are important people? And sort of then we came up with a list, and with our students, they got trained in using some of these digital means, etc., but also in techniques of archiving, but also brought their own perspectives on why they thought and how they thought these people were important. And that led to a dialogue where there was also learnings for them. So many of them also talked about this idea of that every generation thinks that their questions are new, and in some ways they are, but there's always something to learn from what people have tried in the past. And sometimes I think that organic link becomes much easier to do in a process like that. So that is what the process actually of the digital blue plaques was. And we have now these digital blue plaques on all these women and men, some men who have rethought in that sense what gender could have been, who have contributed to a remapping in that sense of the gender history. So their biographies and also links to the other archival material that exists. And so our students also actually went to the places where they live, took photographs of the buildings as they stand now. So it was also a process of connecting it to what exists around them today. So that was actually the process of the blue plaques.
Okay, so as I understand it, we won't find those the plaques that you came up with through this process. They're not actually physical plaques that we will find on buildings in Pune, but we will find them on Sahapedia's cultural map. Okay, how does one convince the Pune Municipal Corporation to acknowledge the existence of the people who you are acknowledging through the culture map?
So that's the next battle. I mean, that's really the next battle, right? So the first has been to create this knowledge. The second, of course, and a much larger battle, therefore, and which also will require other kinds of therefore public engagement. And we hope that Sahapedia also would be interested in taking some of these helping us push some of these issues ahead, because that's really the struggle. Because ultimately there's going to be a small group of people who's going to go onto the Sahapedia culture map and click on it and read these plaques, but everybody walks on the roads of Pune. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, that is the next step of the struggle.
Yeah.
Can I come in on this question that you asked, Sneha? How
Yes.
does one convince the Pune Municipal Corporation?
Yeah.
As Sneha said, that the first step is to create that resource. And I think the thing is that municipal corporations and other, because I think you're talking not only about municipal corporations, but how does one get this information out to the wider public so that it becomes common sense as opposed to a restrictive resource, which is which in intention maybe for free use, but in actuality doesn't happen. I think the first step is to create the resource, which many of us are doing. And to understand that municipal corporations and other authorities are deeply lazy and indifferent where gender histories are concerned. And the first excuse that they will offer is, where's the resource? How will we find the stuff? There is no material, etc. I mean, you only have to look at your own medium, journalism and television, and to look at the panels on television, which are 99.9% men. And when you ask, or when you raise the question, you will be told, but where are the women? And yet there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, say, women economists and others and others. So unfortunately, it has become our responsibility to create these resources. But once we create them, then you can try to deal with the laziness or indifference of those in authority. But I think that also that is not the only place where we want these resources to go. As Sneha has said time and again, that for us as feminists, the idea of creating alternative counter knowledges to the knowledge that has dominated and doing it through the kinds of archives that we build, the process of how you build that archive, with whom you build it, how collectively it is built, and how that strengthens the community, and how you return that archive to the community. so that they have the resources. And I'll give you one example from the time of COVID. So in this year and a half that we have had COVID, I think it goes without saying that the ways in which the feminist women's community has rallied round across the country in many of their connections with communities on the ground to deflect, to stop all the work they're doing and direct it all towards relief. It would be, I mean, so fascinating to know who was the first person who said relief packages must have sanitary towels in them. It wasn't the guys, it has to be a woman somewhere. Nevertheless, they have done all this. And, you know, in many places, women who have been the recipients of these materials, because they trust the ASHA worker or the field worker who at a risk of her own health will go out and provide this thing, have told them their stories. And if you look at the net, at many organizations have been collecting these stories and putting them out. So almost in real time, we have a phenomenon that is changing women's lives and a really invaluable documentation of the ways in which it is changing it. Imagine how amazing this archive is, because it goes back to the women who created it. They will learn from it. They will feel validated that our experience is out there. So, okay, the Pune Municipal Corporation doesn't carry these plaques on buildings, and okay, if the public doesn't see them, maybe at some stage they will, but there are other directions in which we have to direct, and other ways in which we have to think of public access, and we have to think of sharing knowledge. So I would just say that that question has to be asked differently.
Okay, I was just wondering though, you know, because we're talking about the blue plaques and because it's such a mainstream way of archiving and telling the stories of people who've made a difference to our histories. In India, there is a constant talk about how we are a wonderful ancient civilization and we are an amazing culture. Ours is a superior culture to, I mean, this is a constant talk in the mainstream, and with, you know, the advent of a very aggressive nationalism in recent years, especially, this talk is always there. And yet, what is it about our culture that there is a tendency to not respect the need for archiving? And even something as simple as, I was, you know, looking at a photo on the social media that someone had put up when they were visiting a city in the UK where Sir Syed Ahmed Khan had stayed, a building where Syed Ahmed Khan had very briefly been. And there was a plaque outside that said that he had been there. And so a historian on Twitter shared a photo of a place Sir Syed Ahmed Khan had lived in Delhi. And it's a dingy place. There is nothing to mark it out from anybody, for anybody who's passing by. I mean, you wouldn't realize that there is, you know, this is a place of such historical significance. What is it about our culture and our mindset that although we keep harping on the greatness of our civilization, we don't seem to value I mean, we don't seem to place as much value on preservation and conservation as we should. And as we see in the cultures that we look down upon as not as ancient and wise and having influenced the world as we did. Urvashi?
Okay. So that's a fairly complicated question. I don't know how adequately I can address it, but I think that really what you're asking is in many ways about memory and the preservation of memory in different ways. And I think that we are by and large a culture that sadly has become very fearful of memory because we have been pushed more and more into thinking of the past as something that you can selectively mine to prove your point, and the rest of it you put aside because thinking about it or opening yourself up to it is dangerous, and you will not be able to deal with it. And this is the discourse that we are fed all the time, as if people don't have the maturity to understand that the past can be complex and complicated, and it doesn't have to be a singular narrative. So even to our very recent past, I mean, let me give you an example that because I have studied partition, I often wonder why we are so frightened of collecting in India and in Pakistan archives of people's stories of partition. The archives that exist are outside of our countries because we don't have I think we're just fearful of doing it because in India, our narrative that we are spiritual, non-violent, egalitarian will completely fall flat on its face when we see the deep violence and the deep inegalitarianisms in our society. So for us, it's very convenient to hold off all of that and to say, no, there is no need for this. And because you keep absenting it, it is almost as if it didn't exist. So I think that there is that, and this narrative of us being spiritual and us being ancient and us having a huge tradition, this is a very self-serving narrative, which I think needs to be questioned. And that is precisely why it makes it so difficult.
Sneha, would you address the question too?
No, I think I agree with Urvashi, and I think that that's what it does, right? I mean, at no point in history is as simple as the narrative of mainstream history would like us to believe. And if in that sense you start, preserving all that exists, then you can never create a singular story that is simple, because you will always have something that exists that counter. And despite our efforts to not do that, we have that, right? I mean, in that sense, despite our efforts to not really look at these complexities, you cannot wish them away. But if you start preserving them, then you have to, in that sense, in some ways, deal with that complexity, and then it becomes really difficult to say, oh, this is how it was and nothing else, because I think no historical epoch is just this and nothing else, and I think that is, and I think it's also got to do with a complex question of how do we, because it's also about thinking about how do you reconcile with questions of violence, and in that sense questions which are inconvenient facts in history, and I don't think, I mean, in a sense, if we just sort of compare and contrast it to, for instance, the discourse on race, which is now talking of reparations, etc., or Holocaust, which is has been so much thought about. I mean, we can't even, for instance, look at think about confronting the fact of that violence, let alone preserve its memory and think of restorative justice. So I think it's also a question not just therefore of preservation of history, but also of the fact that history is often inconvenient, violent, hierarchical, and that therefore we have to confront fundamentally the question of justice, and that I think is a question that despite many movements, many people struggling for it, I think we continue to be a deeply iniquitous and unjust society, and I think that has something to do with the peculiarity also of the way caste is so central to our ways of being, where in some sense the very notion of inequality, as Dr. Ambedkar would say, the very notion of inequality is central to our very, so like he says, even conceptually you cannot think of the possibility of equality and, so to say, fraternity amongst human beings. I mean, whether it exists in practice is another question, and we can debate that, but many other contexts at least have a conceptual idea of that all are equal, whether it is in the eyes of God or whatever, but that there is a conceptual notion of equality and fraternity. And what happens in a context where even notionally at the very core of our beings that notion does not exist, then our histories, which are so iniquitous and whatever, you cannot confront them, and one of the ways of not having to confront them is to then not preserve those, because we don't want to, I feel, also really engage with a fundamental question of justice.
Okay.
Actually, if I can just quickly add, I'm sorry, Anna, just that the point that Sneha made about justice, I think that's a very, very important point. I mean, all your points are important, but I just wanted to reiterate that, because I think that the search for the exploration of different kinds of memories, the excavation of forgotten and marginalized and, how should I say, silenced histories, is actually essentially at its heart a search for justice. And it is questioning exactly what Sneha is talking about, the inegalitarianism of the societies we live in and how certain identities are completely marginalized. So, and that's what's so fearful about it. And also, I think that where history is concerned, we have inherited or taken on board from the British or from the West this notion of a linear history. You know, that it's chronology and a linearity, whereas in a country as diverse and different as ours, history is happening simultaneously at many levels. You know? It isn't as, and so when you're doing the linear, you cannot describe everything, so you take only the most obvious and you leave everything and everyone else out of it.
Yeah. Urvashi, also, I was wondering if we could look into, because we thought no one should think that this is a discussion only on how patriarchy has tried to control historical narratives and marginalize the stories of women, but could we also look at how feminist archivists have dealt with the heterogeneity within the word woman, and whether there has been an invisibilizing of Dalit women, of trans women, of women in the entire LGBT plus community, while we are archiving women's histories, achievements, and the struggles of women at large by those who are battling patriarchy and not necessarily battling and not necessarily addressing the hierarchy of marginalization even within the term or the concept of woman.
So I think what you're saying is that if there is within quote simplistic assumption of discrimination based on gender, which does not take into account the intersectionality of caste and class and religion and sexuality and various other things with it, and is are feminist archiving practices guilty of doing that? So I wouldn't go so far as to say feminist archiving practices are guilty of doing that. What I would say is that it is a process even for feminist archivists to learn this, and that there has been throughout an openness and willingness to engage, but also if, let's say, in early feminist archives are, as is very likely, held and populated by upper class women, then one thing is to open yourself up to new understandings and to open yourself up to the hierarchies that are there inherent inside the feminist movement. But the other is also to step very carefully and to not then take over the space that other communities may wish to create for themselves. If I can translate this into an example, so when we started as publishers, we were publishing the voices of women, and we did not have such a strong awareness of the layeredness of the inequalities that are there. And for example, the sexuality movement kind of started within a few years of the so-called mainstream feminist movement, and the trans movement started a little bit later, and so on. So how to continue to understand these realities, that was a challenge for us. But not only that, because when you start something and you make something of it, you acquire a place and a reputation which you can so easily exploit. So now we all the time are very aware of the simultaneously the importance of publishing and bringing to the surface diverse voices from the margins, but also of not occupying that terrain as a publisher who started off with upper class women in it. And also then looking at our practice and asking ourselves the question, which is being asked of us by, let's say, Dalit women's groups and others, that if you consider yourself purveyors of knowledge, if you consider yourself people who are center staging marginalized knowledges, have you looked at your own caste and class background? Because you might be creating that kind of knowledge, but you are still performing the task of power in curating it. So if, and what they're saying is, if our voices are not there in that curation, then how can you claim that you're making some change? So the challenges are really, I think, very important. And it would be wrong of us to deny that we are learning as we go along. But at the same time, I don't think that the early feminists of my generation, had a simplistic understanding of patriarchy. I think the intersectionality of feminism was always part of our practice. We may not have articulated it as such, but it was always deeply part of our practice, which is why looking at the challenge that religion and feminism threw up was something that people had to take into account. And there have been many very fraught exchanges over that, which would be great to document in an archive. It really would. And that, I think, is one of the things, which is that feminism, as in India, feminists are not fearful of documenting and opening themselves up to multiple, complicated, and very, very difficult histories. You know, there's no pretense that it was all hunky-dory always. So there's no hiding of the challenges we are facing now. And I really think if we were able to find a way to document all this, this would be a hugely important thing to do. I don't know if that answers your question, because I think I've wandered off a little bit somewhere else. But
no. I just want to clarify, though, that I wasn't necessarily talking only about women who are senior feminists. I'm talking about feminists at large, including those of my generation and younger women. I'm aware, of course, of the hard work that you have put into recording the intersectionalities, and not just of addressing the concerns of upper caste Hindu women in the work that you have done. But you spoke of an openness among archivists to learn. And while it's very clear that you're open to the questions and comments that I'm making, one has not always seen that openness from many others within the community. There has often been a resistance. This is not necessarily within India. In fact, there have been feminists who have been very resistant to even the acknowledgement of a trans person as being a woman. In fact, there is a term that is not yet very popular in India, but the trans exclusionary radical feminist. How would you address this as a concern for any feminist of any generation? And how can we, I want to add a question to this, Urvashi. How can we ensure that within the feminist movement, we make sure we archive the histories of Dalit women, trans persons, people of all marginalized communities within this, within the bracket of women, and yet ensure that we are not constantly fighting each other in such a way that patriarchy can take advantage of that and just be, it's most convenient if we are all fighting each other and trying to marginalize one marginalize the other, instead of seeing that ultimately we have this big monster that we have to continue to fight, which is the effort of patriarchy to marginalize all of us.
And I actually, first of all, I think battles are good, okay? And I think what happens is that we tend to worry when feminists fight, because we expect that all feminists will love each other, but we don't. Sister love is great, But there's a lot of sister tension, sister hate, sister anger, all of that. We're human. It's fine. We fight with each other, but we also work together despite our battles in different ways. And sometimes we go our separate ways, sometimes we'll work together. I think that's part of any movement. And if you're looking at a movement that is as broad-based, as complex, as full of contradictions, as leaderless as the feminist movement is, then the battles are part of it. They actually don't worry me. Yes, they are cause for concern, and even we have to find our way through them somehow to remain open. Then, you talked of trans women and the question of trans women and this whole business of TERFs and so on. So, for me, history is always the place where I would learn from. So let me tell you that I think it was 2006, the Kolkata conference. So we used to have these large women's movement conferences, which were unfunded and so on. And in the conference in Kolkata, for the first time, had trans people in it, trans women in it. There was a lot of fear and discussion about the presence of trans women, because we were all in one large stadium, that's Salt Lake Stadium, and we were all slept there and ate there and had the meeting there. And a lot of women felt, and they weren't all feminists, a lot of women felt nervous, saying these are men, and how can we sleep in their midst, and so on. Now, from that point, we have come to a point today where there is an ongoing discussion. There may be some rejection, but there is also a lot of openness and acceptability that trans women are women, or women can be feminists, that even that men can be feminist. I mean, within the feminist movement, people are talking, Sneha was talking earlier of male allies and people you can work with and searching for them in history. To me, that's progress. Now, I remember an incident which at that time didn't strike me. There was a friend of mine from Australia, a lesbian friend, some big conference, and some very long back, even before 2006, and some trans people from Thailand dancing there. And she was very angry looking at them. And she was saying, we have created a space for ourselves in the women's movement with such difficulty. Now it's being taken over by these people who are essentially men. So, I hesitate to say this because I don't want to be quoted out of context, but I think from that moment to this moment, there is a lot of progress. And I think that's what we have to look at, that it is really a process of learning. Nobody comes into a political movement with all the answers. We struggle with them. We find some answers which satisfy, some don't. Some questions remain troubling questions. But at least we don't dismiss them.
Okay. Yes, Sneha, I know that you want to say something.
Say one thing in addition to all that Urvashi has said, and I think that also that sense of what the feminist movement has done or not done, or in that sense, majorly what it has done, I think also comes from a certain problem of archiving, which is linked to the scale of where we see feminist movements. In the sense that often we think of the feminist movement in India, the Indian feminist movement, and a lot of these, also histories tend to get concentrated around metropolitan, certain kinds of spaces. And in fact, if you look at the, regional histories, if you look at, for instance, Tamil Nadu, you look at Maharashtra, specific regions, the trajectories, for instance, of, the ways in which this, the gender caste intersection, for instance, or the gender caste sexuality intersection, for instance, has been debated, shaped, taken on board within feminist movements, has been very different from our sense of what the feminist movement does. So I think it's also in some ways, and that's not to therefore say that there have not been problems, and there would always be. I mean, as Urvashi rightly pointed out, all politics is a process of learning, and it's always a process of confront, because at one point you're trying to create a subject called woman as a as a legitimate subject of activism, as a legitimate subject of knowledge production, and then you realize, and like she said, even at that moment, in a sense, you are trying to talk about women because everybody's talking about class. And so, in fact, the Indian women's movement has also been in some ways, we've also said that, oh, it was always focused on the poor woman. The poor woman itself is an intersectional, category that looks at class and gender. I mean, we think of intersection now in the context of race and caste, but there have been other ways of doing that. And I think the regional histories have actually had very interesting and different trajectories, which again goes back to this question of what do we archive and where does our sense then of this history sort of come from. So that's just something I wanted to add.
Okay, I have actually so many questions to ask based on what Urvashi and you have said, but I also see that there are a bunch of questions that have popped up from our listeners. So I'm going to start with one from Sudesh Agarwal, who asks how important are oral traditions in building a woman's archive, given that women have been stereotyped as indoor beings. Urvashi, Sneha, which one would you... Urvashi, would you address this?
Yes, sure. Okay. Yeah, I think that oral traditions are extremely important, actually. They value and importance of oral histories and folk tales that are handed down from generation to generation through women, has been recognized and has been actually pointed at by women. It's in the male domain of what is worth recording and what is not worth recording. Orality hardly figured. It's mostly women who have done that. And it is true that women are relegated to the domestic sphere by and large, but at the same time, that does not mean that they do not listen, internalize. I mean, when Anna started this thing, she mentioned songs. If you just take the tradition of women's songs, that's another map of our culture. And all these traditions actually lie in the hands of women. They do hand them down. Of course, what gets written up and what gets published has men's name on it often, but oral traditions are very important and very much located in the realm of women.
Okay, there's a question from Kanika Chavla. She says, is it the lack of public awareness that is actually pushing these real life stories to the background in the mainstream media? Now, I'm going to combine Kanika's question with one that I know, Urvashi, I'm very concerned about. You are a far more patient human being than I am. I feel constantly frustrated with the fact that people like you are building these archives. And I want to know, how can we get the mainstream media to acknowledge the existence of these archives and to make use of these archives? And I'm talking about the mainstream news media. So yes, it's wonderful if women's studies departments in universities are using them, but how does one get the mainstream media to use these archives so that because there is a huge amount of marginalization within the whole realm of news giving and the storytelling within news organizations. So my question, and Kanika's, if you could address that. Urvashi, Sneha.
I think let Sneha respond, and then because I've been talking too much.
No, I think, to sort of go to Kanika's question, yes, to an extent, public awareness, but also the changing nature of the mainstream media. In some ways, and again, we know this, and Urvashi would be able to speak much more about it. There was a certain space for feminist interventions to be documented and become a part of, mainstream media in a certain historical moment, and that really did also, that really did also help in many ways, give a certain, visibility to the movement, to its issues, and create, therefore, in some ways, we also have to acknowledge the fact that there is a shift in the general public's common sense about, say, something like sexual violence or something like domestic violence today than in the 70s, and so there has been that, and I think therefore it's I mean, there is a big part of it is also about the changing nature of the mainstream media, the way in which neoliberal capitalism has come to be, so central in the ways in which increasingly when, newspapers are not dependent, for instance, on subscriptions, they are dependent on advertising, for running. So I think it's in some ways got to do with that. I think Urvashi is better this thing to answer that question about how do we push for these knowledges, like you said. But I think that there is also value not only therefore. So when they are taught in the women's studies department, they're not just taught in the women's studies department, in the sense that when we are located in the university, it's not only that we are teaching it to our students. These perspectives also become ways then of, so the university is also a space that is that needs transformation. And in fact, over the last few years, we have had such, vibrant movement by young people asking questions about the nature of the university, even the public university, and the kinds of knowledges it produces, the space, etc. So I think that even within, in that sense, the university, I think this sort of saying that, oh, the university is one sort of, ivory tower space as versus, in that sense, the larger public, I think is also a notion that we need to rethink, especially in a context where we have seen a changing nature of higher education in India, where we have actually today some of the highest gross enrollment ratios in higher education in India. So there has been a vast sort of expansion of higher education, and one of the things that we overlook often is that higher education is the only space, the only public sphere in India today where we have achieved near gender parity. I mean, and of course that the fact that there are almost 50% women in higher education doesn't mean that issues being solved. It leads to more questions. But in the university today are, exactly the kinds of men and women that we are talking about, whose histories we want to document and whose histories we want to archive, etc. They are in our classrooms as, as students, because you largely have men and women coming from hitherto, groups which are not in the university. In a public university like ours, you don't have upper class men in the classroom at all. It's upper class, middle class women and Dalit Bahujan men, and then a smaller this thing of Dalit Bahujan women. So I think that also, I think this idea that the university versus the real space also needs to be rethought, because the nature of the university, definitely the public university, and also this further segmentation then of private universities, where, it's a whole different set of people who are going, is also in that sense happening. So I think there is also value in bringing these into the curriculum, because the people who are learning it are not, it's not the ivory tower of the Oxford, Cambridge University that we imagine. So I just wanted to, I'm not really equipped to say, how can women's organizations push for these, for in the media. But I think from the space of higher education, I think that sort of a dichotomy of the university versus this thing also, I think, has changed. And there is value, therefore, in having these courses in public universities, not just in the women's studies department, but also, for instance, we have, students from across social sciences taking up credit courses in women's studies, and they do take back, however limited these ideas might be. It's not that, it's like that. I mean, the lens really is a lens where once you see, you can't unsee, and it does do something, I feel.
Okay. Though, of course, I must clarify that I wasn't looking at a university as an ivory tower, but my concern is that the university is still a space where you go to, where you're seeking out an education. And is it possible to ensure that the mainstream media also makes use of the archives of women's histories that have been created with such hard work by groups working in this area? Because the mainstream media gets served to you at your doorstep, as opposed to us seeking out an education. So Urvashi, would you look at that question too?
I just want to say that Sneha has said everything so beautifully that I think I don't really need to go there, except to add that to go back to the university, that women's studies or courses on gender are not only taught in women's studies courses, but there has been enough, not enough, but there's been a lot of change in syllabi and the introduction of aspects of gender in many different courses. And of course, Sneha talked about more and more women enrolling for education. And she talked about the public universities. Let me talk about the private university, because I teach in a few private universities. And I cannot tell you, Anna, how curious and interested my students are in men and women, in issues of women's history, in issues of gender, because these are upper class kids, but they are confronting this every day in their lives and they need to understand it. And to me, actually, that's really important. Now, getting into the mainstream media, I know that is your concern. So in some ways, I think, as Sneha said, the mainstream media is a bit of a dead loss in our country, not because of not being inclusive of gender, but because of not being inclusive of anything. They have never been that interested in the histories of those on the margins. It has always been a very upper class, very Hindu, very urban sort of thing. Nevertheless, and today, of course, it's much worse because there is also the politics of who you align with and who you don't align with. Having said that, I think that the questioning of women in media and the push by women to enter media and to change media from within, there are today many more women journalists, many of whom are willing to go more than just that extra mile to put in the kinds of stories that would do justice to women's histories. So the media is not the monolith. By and large, yes, there is this indifference and there is this blocking of gendered histories, but within there are always people who are trying to change it. And I think that those are our allies, and they could be men and women. And there are, internet channels and so on. So you have other ways of getting this information out. There is a newspaper like Feminism in India, which is constantly publishing different archives. There's The Wire, there's Scroll, there's so many other things, Leaflet, and I mean, so many things, the India Forum, NewsClick. And those things are quite widely read. So if the big newspapers and others don't do this, I think it's really their loss. And I think also the thing is that, we can't be tasked with the responsibility of changing this big monolith. We are producing the material, we're doing what educational institutions should do, what historians should do, what the state should do. We're doing it all. Now, at least, get off your backside and start looking at the material. That is important. We can't do that also.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions to ask, but we are, I know, running out of time. We've gone beyond the hour that we intended to be. But I'm going to go with a question by Sarasi Ganguly. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Sarasi. In the context of national events, like the partition or independence, are the struggles of ordinary women often forgotten? And is that why documentation is so important today? Now, both of you have touched upon this in various ways through this discussion, but maybe if you could specifically address, I think, the partition, independence movement and partition. Urvashi, you've done a lot of work in that area. So could we go with you first?
Yeah, so Sarisi, the narrative of partition, as you know, which was taught to us in our schools and universities till about 20 years ago, was a narrative which basically focused on political parties and political leaders. And it is only when feminist historians started to open up this space that we could see the different ways in which women were impacted or women were involved in partition. And that's not only as victims of sexual violence, because that has been talked about, but also as participants in the state's rescue efforts, also as women who worked with those who were abducted and raped, also as women social workers, also as women who set up educational institutions, and so on and so forth. So that whole history has started to open up. There's still a lot more, which gives us a completely different understanding of partition. Now, just as that history started to open up, so also, and this is important, that there are other aspects of partition which were equally silenced because of this focus of centering it around New Delhi, Lahore, urban India leaders. So you don't get to hear about how partition touched on so many other places in our country, such as Gujarat, Hyderabad, Bombay, the Khasi Hills, Assam, the entire Northeast, Tripura. I mean, these are all areas which partition deeply influenced, but the narrative of partition first was Punjab and then was Bengal and stopped over there. So here is another set of marginalized histories. Then, the whole history of partition, even when its opening up started, was understood in terms of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims. But there are so many other communities. For example, there was a whole Dalit history, which nobody has talked about. Well, not nobody, I'm sorry, I don't want to say nobody has talked about, which has been talked about, but it is still being opened up. There was a Dalit history in Punjab. The Dalits demanded a homeland of their own in Punjab, saying, you're giving it to the Hindus, you're giving it to the Sikhs, you should give it to us also. There was a whole history of Namashudras in the East, where they continue to be marginalized and displaced and pushed off to inhospitable lands till I think late 70s, sometime in the 70s or early 70s something, when the left government displaced them yet again. So there is another history of communism and caste, which is so it's not, with the ways in which history focuses only on the powerful, even a history as recent as partition, where until a few years ago, most of the survivors were still with us. It has taken us a long time to look at the layeredness of this history, and there is still much more to discover, I think.
Yeah, this just on a personal note, this reminds me of a challenge somebody threw, a regular troll threw on Twitter a few years ago. He said, oh, there are no Muslim freedom fighters. Can you even name 5? And it became a whole thing on social media that day, because everyone was, I mean, come on, Muslim freedom fighters, you can fill books with just names. So I also joined in, and I tweeted a list of Muslim freedom fighters. So one guy who's clearly from the IT cell said, okay, that's easy. Name even 2 Christian freedom fighters. And I was startled, because to me, this is just obvious information. But for instance, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur is a Christian, and I I grew up knowing this. Violet and Joe, Kimalva, Kamacherian, Rosama Punnus, so many people, but just this notion that the freedom fighter was North Indian, male, Hindu upper caste. And even though someone like Maulana Azad is so much in the public consciousness, for someone to have the audacity in the public realm to say, name a Muslim freedom fighter is representative of the times we live in, where there is so much of an openness. Obviously, everyone throughout time dominant communities have tried to manipulate the recording of history, but right now there is an openness in doing that I, at least in my lifetime, haven't seen. Okay, there's a question from Padma Priya, after which I think we absolutely have to wind up. Padma Priya writes, amidst the chaos of managing activism in running gender rights organizations, how does one practically allocate time and resources to create an authentic version of the experience as we are living it? Should this be an effort initiated from inside or outside such organizations? Oh, wow. Yes, that's true. We are living witnesses to history, but we forget that, don't we? Okay, Sneha, we'll come to you with this, and then we'll wrap up with Urvashi's answer.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It is a struggle. And in fact, I mean, one of the reasons that, women's groups had to, I mean, they had, like Zubaan had to do the Poster Women project, was because all these organizations which had run all of these campaigns did not have the time and the space and the opportunity to actually document what it is that they were doing. So it is a real struggle, and it has been a real struggle. The answer to that, I think also comes therefore from looking at an effort like Poster Women, where I think that, like Padma Priya's, I don't think it is an effort that can be initiated either or, from inside or from outside, but necessarily only through processes of collaboration where, so organizations like, like Zubaan or like a Women's Studies Center, which are more focused sometimes on and have sometimes the resources to do more of this, documentation and whatever. I think only collaborations and partnerships and working together, where both, I mean, those who are documenting don't take a higher space of, oh, you do, we document, and vice versa. Sometimes that, oh, this is, what is the point of writing all this, you have to do. I think, thinking of these as processes which are dialectical, intrinsically linked to each other, in that sense, activism and like the doing and the thinking, and that has been actually, I mean, which is also why, like we often say, right, that the history of feminism in India is so intrinsically linked up with the history of doing. And if you look at the history of doing, it is so intrinsically linked up with rethinking and thinking. So, I mean, I would say that the only way forward is not either or, in terms of either putting that burden on organizations which are already pushing for activism, to also then document it themselves, or just have external. I would say that the only probable answer for this, and of course that will, I mean, it's easy to say that, oh, collaborate. I know that, it has many nitty-gritties of, how, when, where. There are questions then of, like of ownership, etc. But I think that the histories of feminism actually have many lessons on the ways in which, authorships can be collective. You don't need to have individual ownership of whatever. There can be ways of sharing, where resources are made available with acknowledgement, so that the effort that has gone into it also does not get invisibilized. So I think that, a probable answer actually is to look at some of these efforts and, collaboration, solidarity, sister love, in a very, in a not a very mushy, warm, we are all whatever together, but in a very encounter sort of a way, right? Because love is also about encountering each other with all our differences. I think the only possible way that I can think of is not either inside or outside, but maybe collaboration. I don't know if that makes sense.
Urvashi?
Yeah, I think I mean, again, as usual, Sneha said it so beautifully that I think this is a good tactic to wait for her to say it. So then I have to only just come in to add the stuff. But no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think collaboration is really important. And it isn't a question of inside or outside. It often has to be both, or one of the two. But I think also, one of the things that is a struggle is that women and women working in women's organizations, no matter where they come from, have this sense, despite fighting to center stage our lives and the histories of women, we still have this sense that I can't write my story. I can't write about myself because it's not. So why do you see so few women's autobiographies? Why do you see so few women's autobiographies of women who actually have a lot to say about their lives? It's because they devalue themselves, they hold themselves back, they push themselves back. And so we lose a lot of what could be really interesting histories that could come through those lives. And I think it's just important to work around that. One of the things we tried to do was to do interviews with women in the feminist movement or in the women's movement to try and map through women's lives, the directions, the trajectories in which the women had gone. And I think Sneha's right that you take a look at different kinds of projects and you try to see how those have worked. One of the things that some organizations have tried, but again, it's not very sustainable, is that when you start work, say you start work on a COVID relief project and it's running for 6 months or 1 year or something, every day you document in a sort of diary what is happening. And everybody writes their own account, and then you put those together and you have a really valuable documentation of that time, which is internal, but which can also be shared externally. And sometimes if you can manage that, it works, but sometimes it's quite tough. in terms of time. So I think we have to be aware of constraints of time. We have to be aware of the difficulty of getting women to write about themselves. Sometimes they don't have the vocabulary, sometimes they don't have the confidence, sometimes they don't have the time, all of those things. And we have to be aware that if there is one movement in this country which knows the value of collaborations, it is the women's movement. And so if any movement can do this kind of recording collaboratively, it is the women's movement.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I think it's important for me to acknowledge over here that this is also where my profession comes in, because it is our job to look beyond, chronicling the lives of just movie stars and presidents and prime ministers, and to look at the lives of women who have fought battles that have brought us to a place where we have the strength and the time to fight newer battles. So it's as much our job, it's in fact far more our job to do it. And of course, to urge publishing houses to publish the stories of women. And because I know from personal experience, just looking at this panel, Urvashi, how much I learned from reading your account of why you are a single woman. It was just, although we belong to different generations, in a certain sense, I felt like I'm reading my story. And I remember seeing a comment on the internet by some fellow who said, "Oh, I came here to be moved by her story, and I haven't cried even one drop of a tear." So a woman wrote to him saying, "But why were you expecting to be sad about her while reading her account of why she's single?" So, you just turned that on its head, the assumption of the single woman is this sad creature. You just completely, exploded whatever was, stereotype he had in his head. So yes, we do need more of us, people from my profession, telling the stories of women like Urvashi, Sneha, Padma Priya. And thank you so much, both of you, for being here. And I think now Padma Priya is going to take over.
Gosh, this was such an insightful conversation. Leaves a lot for all of us to think about. So much, very much thanks to Anna, Urvashi, Sneha, all of you for joining us and sharing these precious words. It's what helps us move forward. For everybody in the audience out there, before we sign out today, reminder, go visit map.sahapedia.org whenever you have time, and join us through the next 5 weeks of celebrations for fun such conversations and much more. And that's all. Have a great evening and have a great weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.